Despite the fact that, as we showed you earlier in the program, 65% of the world's carbon emissions come from developing countries, the remaining rich countries like Australia, the United States, Canada, you get it, are apparently going to now have to pay reparations to what we used to call the third world, the developing world, because of the climate consequences, despite the fact that they now produce more emissions than the first world or developed world. It's all come out of COP today. It's all been signed off and led in conversation by Chris Bowen, but they won't tell us how much it's going to cost. Chris Mitchell joins us now as a columnist with The Australian, former editor of the newspaper and a mate of the program. Chris, lovely to see you.
Hi, Paul.
So, at the start of this process, it was reparations, but we were told don't say reparations because that freaks people out. Yet it's what the UN's always wanted, which is the rich world to pay for the poor world, and they've finally found a way to do it, but no numbers connected yet. Is this a surprise?
Well, look, we may well be waiting for numbers till the climate catastrophe of 2030. And look what will happen. There'll be no climate catastrophe and still no numbers.
Yeah. But then, of course, we've got at the heart of this as well that one of the developing countries is China. Now, there is no promise whatsoever in what we've heard about in the past 24 hours that a dollar of this doesn't end up in China. How do you feel about the farce that China gets to call itself a developing country because, in my view, it deliberately keeps a certain number of people dirt poor while also having a space station?
Yeah, and soon to be the number one economy in the world. And I thought there was an interesting number that Boris Johnson talked about, the fact that China had more emissions in the last 8 years than the UK had since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So wow. China should surely be paying if we're going to.
So let's talk about what you wrote about a couple of weeks ago, which is about journalists and their role in all of this, that literally, as they used to say, about Trump, he's post-truth. I think we're post-logic on this. I mean, it doesn't matter how many times we point out that Australia is 1% of the problem. The Guardian would make you think that we're the entire problem.
Yeah, 100% right. And also, a lot of these climate writers refuse to sort of state the obvious that, we're told each COP that there's going to be a set reduction in emissions over the next 12 months. And of course, over the last 12 months since Glasgow, emissions went up 6%. And I think you can safely bet, Paul, that they'll go up again in the next 12 months. So, it is another world. This thing has its own impetus, but it seems to be disconnected from reality.
Well, but also, clearly the only thing anyone remembers out of the federal budget for its lack of help on cost of living, but certainly was the power price thing, right? But the government, to use the Twitter terminology, is gaslighting people to pretend that it's all about the cost of fossil fuels, none of which to do with the cost of transition, which is hundreds of billions of dollars worth of new technology that needs to be built to get us to nirvana. But again, all of this is left out. They just say, Prime Minister says 83%, as if everyone's happy for it to be built on their bit of rural Australia, and it's apparently not going to cost a cent, both of which are not true.
Yeah, well, The Guardian doesn't want to talk too much about the 10,000 kilometres of extra power lines or the 5 Tasmania-sized wind farms that are talked about for the Northern Territory. I'm not sure how the environment movement's going to come to terms with all of that when they start to understand what's entailed.
Do you think their assumption is that because, love is on their side, because the vibe is with them, that basically to talk about transition means that you're the climate denier? Like, remember someone, pulled together a bunch of YouTube videos and said, see, climate denialism, but that included conversations on this channel about the cost of transition. It's like they're just a steamroller, obviously solar powered and going down a hill, and it doesn't matter what the reality is. It doesn't matter about the poor people who literally are choosing about whether or not... There's a lady in Tasmania who talks about how she chooses not to wash her clothes because she wants to keep all of her utility bills down, but these people mean nothing, so we can win over the teals and Twitter every day.
Well, I think in teal seats, people can certainly afford the transition, but people on fixed incomes in the western suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, they'll struggle. They won't be able to have, rebates for solar panels on their roofs. They won't be able to have EVs that are charging on a largely coal-fired system today. It's not a poor-friendly policy at all. And it seems to me that people like Mike Cannon-Brookes and Twiggy Forrest, they're getting away with pretending that doing all this for the poor or for the planet. But, they're probably doing it for their own bank balances, really.
Yeah, this is it. Last time, as there was big oil, there will one day be big wind and big solar, and I thought lefties didn't like that, unless, of course, they're now the ones getting rich. Thank you, Chris. Do appreciate it. Read you, as always, tomorrow in the media section of the Australian newspaper.